It was a quiet night on Earth, or at least it seemed that way. The stars above twinkled like an ancient mystery, their distance from the planet so vast. It almost felt like a dream, but the reality was far from peaceful for Captain Jackson Clark. He had only come to this remote corner of the galaxy because of a desperate mission to rescue an alien species that had been under siege for centuries. Yet, nothing could have prepared him for what he encountered when he reached the isolated planet of Tarva. When Jackson first set foot on the alien soil, he was met by a woman who was unlike anything he had ever seen. She stood tall, her skin shimmering with an otherworldly glow, her eyes deep pools of violet that seemed to pierce through his very soul. Her name was Lyra, and she was the last surviving member of a once thriving civilization, now torn apart by galactic war. Lyra had been raised to believe that humans were weak, primitive, and insignificant. In fact, most of her kind viewed humans as little more than an insect to be squashed underfoot. Yet here Jackson was, a man who had come to her planet, not for conquest, but for peace, to end the violence that had ravaged her people. As they stood face to face, the tension between them was palpable. The air felt thick with a strange energy that neither could ignore. Lyra was beautiful, her skin shimmering like the stars, but there was something else in her eyes, a desperation, a longing, something that told Jackson she had seen too much suffering, and perhaps she was ready for something more. "I didn't think humans were capable of bravery," Lyra said softly, her voice tinged with both curiosity and disbelief. "But here you are, standing in front of me, offering help when others would have turned their backs." Jackson took a step forward, keeping his tone steady, tried to understand the depth of her words. "We're not so different. We fight for what's right for survival." For a moment, Lyra studied him, her eyes scanning his face as though trying to read his every thought. "You don't understand," she whispered, her voice low and filled with an emotion he couldn't quite place. "I've never felt touched. No one has ever reached me. Not like you." Jackson's heart skipped a beat. He had fought countless battles, saved many lives, but this was different. He had never heard an alien speak so vulnerably, so openly. There was something raw in her words, a brokenness that called out to him. "You've never been touched?" he asked, his voice almost betraying the shock he felt. He had assumed, like everyone else, that the alien race would be immune to human emotions, to the complexities of connection. But Lyra, she seemed so very human in that moment. Lyra took a deep breath, her fingers lightly grazing the edge of the crystal-like structure beside them. "No, my people, they are too proud, too focused on their own survival to care for others. I have never known warmth, not in the way you do, not in the way humans understand it." Jackson's mind raced. How could he reconcile this? A woman from a different world, alien in every sense of the word, speaking of feelings and desires so human, it almost felt like a dream. But this wasn't a dream. This was real. And for the first time, Jackson understood that perhaps their worlds, despite the vast differences, were not as far apart as they seemed. He stepped closer, reaching out to her, his voice barely a whisper. "I can show you what it means. To feel, to truly feel." Lyra's eyes darkened, her pupils dilating. There was a flash of something in them, something fierce, something primal. "You think you can? You think you can reach me? Satisfy what's been missing all my life?" Jackson hesitated, but only for a moment. He had come here to help, to fix what was broken. But this was something deeper, something he hadn't planned for. And yet, he couldn't deny the pull, the magnetic force that drew him to her. "I don't know if I can, but I will try," he said, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. Lyra studied him for a long, tense moment, before finally taking a step toward him, her lips curving into a soft, yet dangerous smile. "Then let's see if you're truly as capable as you claim, Captain Clark. Show me if you can satisfy me, if you can touch me in a way no one else ever has." Jackson's pulse quickened. The words hung in the air, charged with a tension neither of them could escape. He had no idea what he was walking into, but for the first time, he felt the weight of the unknown pressing down on him. And there, under the light of two distant suns, their worlds collided. The air between them thickened with anticipation. Jackson stood there, his heartbeat quickening as Lyra closed the gap between them. There was a certain power in her gaze, something fierce and unyielding that seemed to challenge him, testing the very core of who he was. Her words echoed in his mind, a daring invitation he couldn't turn down. But the question lingered. What did she mean by touch me? He had saved planets, fought in wars, and dealt with countless threats, but this was different. Lyra wasn't just an alien, a creature from another world. She was a woman in need, a woman who had been scarred by her own people's arrogance and cruelty. She had seen too much, suffered too deeply, and somehow she had placed her trust, her very vulnerability, into his hands. You think you can reach me? Lyra's voice was low, barely a whisper, but it cut through the tension like a blade. Her breath came faster now, the closeness between them undeniable. Jackson could smell the faint scent of something alien and intoxicating, a fragrance that reminded him of the stars themselves, ancient and unfathomable. I'm here to try, Jackson responded, his voice calm but edged with uncertainty. He wasn't sure if it was a situation or something deeper within him that made him feel so unmoored. But he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just about the mission anymore. It wasn't about saving her species or ending a war. It was about her, and the look in her eyes told him that there was a deeper, more primal need lurking inside her that he didn't fully understand yet. Lyra's fingers brushed against his chest, her touch soft but deliberate. It sent a jolt of electricity through him, something raw and undeniable. She looked up at him then, her eyes searching, as though trying to piece together some grand mystery. You don't know what it's like, she whispered, to feel nothing, to see your entire world fall apart and have no one care, to have power but not love, strength but not connection. Jackson swallowed, the weight of her words pressing against him like a physical force. He had seen war, had witnessed the devastation of entire cities, but never had he encountered something so personal, so intimate, as what Lyra was revealing to him now. He stepped closer, his voice gentle but firm. I can't undo what's happened to you, Lyra, but I can try to give you something different, something better. I can give you what I have, what humans have learned to cherish. She closed her eyes for a moment, as though weighing his words, her breath shallow. When her eyes opened again, there was a flicker of something new, a glimmer of hope, perhaps, or the first spark of trust. I've never known what it's like to be touched, she confessed, her voice trembling slightly. Not in the way you think. My people, they value strength above all else. Emotions are weaknesses, and love, it's a myth, a fantasy. But you make me question everything. He stepped closer, his voice gentle but firm. I can't undo what's happened to you, Lyra, but I can try to give you something different, something better. I can give you what I have, what humans have learned to cherish. She closed her eyes for a moment, as though weighing his words, her breath shallow. When her eyes opened again, there was a flicker of something new, a glimmer of hope, perhaps, or the first spark of trust. I've never known what it's like to be touched, she confessed, her voice trembling slightly. Not in the way you think. My people, they value strength above all else. Emotions are weaknesses, and love, it's a myth, a fantasy. But you make me question everything. Jackson's hand instinctively reached for hers, his fingers brushing against her skin. It was warm, unlike the cold, metallic touch of the ships he had grown so used to. It was human. It was real. And in that moment, everything felt simpler, almost right. I'm not here to change you, Lyra, he said quietly, his eyes locking with hers. But I can show you that there's more to life than just survival. There's more to what you're feeling. I can show you that you're not alone, even if the universe tries to tell you that you are. For a moment, Lyra seemed to hesitate, her eyes flickering with doubt. But then something shifted. A tiny crack appeared in her hardened exterior, and she stepped closer to him. Her voice was soft, almost lost in the hum of the alien world around them. Touch me, Jackson, she whispered. Show me what it's like to feel human. His heart pounded in his chest as he took a deep breath, letting the gravity of the situation settle over him. This wasn't just about the mission anymore. This was about two souls from two completely different worlds, finding something in each other, that neither thought was possible. He reached out, his hand moving to her face, his fingers tracing the delicate curve of her cheek. The sensation was foreign and yet familiar, like touching something ancient, something vital. He leaned in slowly, cautiously, as though testing the waters of this strange new bond they were forging. And when their lips finally met, the world around them seemed to disappear. For a brief moment, there was no war, no aliens, no mission, just two people who had found something more, something profound in each other. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy. But it was real, and that was something Lyra had never known. The kiss was brief, but it lingered long enough to change everything. Jackson pulled back slightly, his eyes searching Lyra's face for any sign of hesitation, but all he found was something raw and unspoken. She seemed as surprised as he was by the intensity of the moment, her breath shallow as she took in the weight of what had just happened. It wasn't just a kiss, it was a declaration. Something had shifted, not just between them, but deep inside her, something Lyra wasn't sure she was ready to face. She stepped back slightly, her violet eyes now clouded with uncertainty. The look in her gaze was both intense and vulnerable, an emotion Jackson hadn't seen before in her. "You shouldn't have done that," she said, her voice quiet but heavy with the weight of her words. Jackson's heart sank. Was she regretting it? Had he made a mistake? He opened his mouth to speak, but she held up a hand to stop him. "No," she continued, shaking her head, her voice growing firmer. "It's not that. It's just, I've never known what this feels like. I've spent my life thinking I was stronger than this, that I didn't need anyone. But now," she paused, her voice faltering slightly, "now, I'm not sure what I want anymore." Jackson reached out again, but this time he wasn't sure if it was to comfort her or to pull her closer. Maybe it was both. "Lyra," he said softly, his voice tender, "you don't have to figure out all at once. I'm not going anywhere. Whatever you need, I'll be here." The words were simple, but they hung in the air with more meaning than anything he'd ever said. He could see the internal struggle in her eyes, the conflict between her lifelong beliefs and the emotions she was feeling now. She had lived a life of isolation, built on the foundation of cold logic and power, yet here was a human offering her something completely different, something that had no place in her world, but felt so incredibly right in this moment. Lyra took a step back, her fingers brushing her lips, still feeling the echo of his touch. She had never thought it would feel like this. In her world, to touch someone was a form of dominance, a way to assert power. But with Jackson, it felt different. She didn't feel weaker. She felt alive in a way she never had before. It scared her more than anything. "You don't understand, Jackson," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "My people, they don't feel like this. There is no love, no affection, no tenderness. It's all power, control. And I was raised to believe that was all that mattered. But now," she looked at him, a fleeting, fragile look of uncertainty in her eyes. "Now, I don't know if I can go back to that. I don't know if I can go back to being that." Jackson felt a knot twist in his chest. He didn't know much about Lyra's people, but he could see the conflict tearing at her. She was a product of her upbringing, just like any of them, but this was different. She wasn't just struggling with what had happened to her people. She was struggling with what he represented, a different way of life, a different belief system that contradicted everything she had known. "Lyra, you don't have to go back to anything," Jackson said, his voice steady. "This is about you. This isn't about your people or your past. It's about what you want, what you deserve. And if that's something different than what you've always known, then that's okay." Her eyes narrowed slightly, studying him with a level of intensity that made his pulse race. "And you think you can give me that? You think that you, a human, can give me something no one else ever has?" Jackson nodded, his eyes never leaving hers. "I don't know if I can give you everything you've missed, but I'm sure as hell going to try. No one deserves to feel like they've never truly lived, not even you." For a moment, the tension between them was suffocating. Lyra stood there, her face unreadable, caught in the conflict of what she'd been taught and what she was beginning to feel. The air around them seemed to hum, charged with the weight of her decision. Finally, she spoke again, her voice low and almost hesitant. "What if I can't let go of my past? What if I can't forget everything I've been taught? You don't have to forget, Jackson replied gently, stepping closer. But you don't have to let it control you, either. You can make your own path, Lyra. You just have to believe that you're worth it. Her eyes searched his face as though looking for any sign of doubt, any crack in his resolve. But all she saw was certainty, and it shook her in a way she hadn't been shaken before. Maybe, she whispered, barely audible, maybe I can try. And that was all Jackson needed to hear. He reached for her hand, taking it gently in his, the touch still as electrifying as it had been before. This time, however, it wasn't just about the heat between them. It was about trust. It was about understanding that they were both navigating unknown territory. Together, Lyra's gaze softened, and for the first time since their meeting, she allowed herself to believe in something more, something greater. And as they stood there, two souls from different worlds, the future felt less like an uncertainty and more like a promise. They didn't have all the answers, but they didn't need them. Not yet. As Jackson and Lyra stood there, holding hands, the world around them seemed to hold its breath. The air was thick with the tension of the moment. Two beings from entirely different worlds, their futures uncertain, yet connected in a way neither had anticipated. Jackson knew they couldn't stay on the edge of this fragile truce forever. There was more at stake than just their personal struggles. He had come here to save her people, to stop a war that had raged for centuries. But now, more than ever, the fate of her people, and perhaps his own, depended on Lyra's ability to let go of the chains that bound her to the past. Lyra, however, seemed to sense that their connection was a turning point, one that would mark the beginning of a transformation she wasn't sure she was ready for. For so long, she had prided herself on her emotional restraint. Her people had taught her to suppress everything, desire, love, even pain, in favor of cold logic and an unyielding sense of superiority. To admit that she wanted something different, that she needed something more, felt like a betrayal of everything she had known. But standing here, with Jackson's hand wrapped around hers, something inside her cracked, a little piece of the wall she had so carefully built crumbling. For the first time, she was seeing the world differently, through his eyes, through the eyes of a human who had nothing to prove, nothing to hide. "You're not like them," she said softly, almost to herself. Her voice held a quiet wonder, a trace of something deeper, something that both scared and intrigued her. "You don't see me as a tool. You don't see me as just a symbol of strength or power. You see me as me." Jackson's thumb brushed across her skin, his touch gentle. "That's because that's all you are to me, Lyra. Just you." Her eyes met his, wide with a mix of disbelief and something like hope. It was a look that both unsettled and reassured him. She was beginning to understand, perhaps for the first time, what it meant to be seen, not for what she represented, but for who she truly was. "But I'm not like you," she said, shaking her head slightly. I'm an alien. My people are conquerors. We fight, we take, we destroy. And I've been taught to use people, to manipulate them. I never thought that someone would see me as more than that." Jackson's expression softened, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "You're so much more than that, Lyra, and you know it." She swallowed hard, the weight of his words sinking deep into her chest. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust in the possibility of something better. But everything inside her fought against it. Could she really change? Could she really shed the beliefs that had been ingrained in her for so long? She felt a sudden sharp pang in her chest, a mix of longing and guilt, and she took a step back, breaking their physical connection. The moment of intimacy had brought her closer to something she wasn't sure she could handle. She stared down at her feet, her mind swirling with conflicting emotions. "I don't know if I can do this," she whispered, her voice barely audible, her fingers twitching at her sides. "I don't know if I can let go of everything I've been taught. I don't know how to be anything other than what they made me." Jackson's hand dropped his side, but his eyes never left her face. "It's not about undoing everything, Lyra. It's about learning to move forward, to be something new. And I'll help you. You don't have to do it alone." Lyra lifted her eyes to meet his once more, her gaze searching, as though trying to decide if he was lying, if his words were empty promises or the truth. She had heard so many promises in her life, empty words spoken by those who wanted power or control. But Jackson's words felt different. There was no agenda behind them, no hidden motive. "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I'm scared of what I could become. I'm scared of losing who I am." Jackson took a slow step toward her, closing the distance between them once again. He didn't say anything at first. He didn't have to. His presence alone was a comfort, a steady force that grounded her in this moment. "I understand fear," Jackson said quietly, "but fear doesn't have to control you. You control it. You can choose to be something different. You don't have to become what your people expected you to be. You can choose your own path." For a long moment, Lyra stood silently, her mind torn between the past and the uncertain future that stretched out before her. But as Jackson stood there, unwavering, a sense of calm began to wash over her. Perhaps he was right. Perhaps the weight of her past didn't have to define her future. Maybe, just maybe, she could find a new way to be. "I don't know if I can do it," she said again, more softly this time, almost like confession. "But I'll try." Jackson smiled, a warmth in his eyes that made her chest tighten. "That's all I'm asking for." Lyra hesitated, then slowly took a step closer to him. Her fingers brushed against his, just a hint of touch, before she grasped his hand again. It was a small gesture, but it meant more than words ever could. "I don't know what comes next, Jackson," she said, her voice steady but uncertain. "But I think I want to find out with you." Jackson's smile widened, and he squeezed her hand gently. "Then let's find out together." As they stood there, hands intertwined, the weight of the future didn't seem quite so heavy. There was still uncertainty, still fear, but there was also hope. And for the first time in her life, Lyra allowed herself to believe in something beyond survival, something beyond the war, something that could be hers, something human. The days that followed were filled with a strange quiet. Lyra had never known peace like this before. On her planet, there had always been noise, constant planning, the hum of military operations, the clamor of battles fought in the name of dominance. But here with Jackson, everything felt different. It was as if they had stepped outside of time, outside the endless conflict that had defined her existence. For the first time in her life, Lyra allowed herself to let go. The walls she had built up, the hardened shell of a warrior, began to crack, though slowly and painfully. She couldn't completely shed the weight of her past, of her people's expectations, but she could feel the first stirrings of something new, something human, stirring within her. Jackson had been patient, never pushing her beyond what she was ready for, but always there, quietly supporting her. Every moment they shared felt like a small step towards something neither of them had ever expected. They would talk for hours, often late into the night, sitting together in the quiet of the base where they had been staying. Jackson would share stories about Earth, his childhood, his family, the world he had come from. Lyra would listen, fascinated by the simplicity of it all. She had always viewed humans as nothing more than fragile creatures, their emotions a weakness. But Jackson was different. He wasn't fragile, nor was he weak. He was strong in a way that defied all the rules she had known. And in turn, Lyra began to share her own story. It wasn't easy. The memories of her past were like jagged stones that scraped at her soul every time she spoke of them. Her people, the Tarvans, had built their entire civilization on conquest. Love was a foreign concept. Emotions were seen as weaknesses. She had been taught that to survive, she had to be cold, calculating, and merciless. But Jackson never judged her. Instead, he listened with empathy, his eyes filled with understanding, not pity. And through it all, Lyra felt something within her begin to shift. She wasn't the sum of her people's beliefs. She wasn't bound by the destiny they had crafted for her. She was something else. She could be something else. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Lyra found herself sitting next to Jackson on the edge of the platform overlooking the alien landscape. The air was warm, the scent of the alien planet's flora intoxicating. The stars, as always, twinkled overhead, distant and mysterious. Jackson turned to her, his expression soft, but filled with an intensity that made her heart skip. "You've been quieter than usual tonight," he said gently, his voice low, almost like a whisper carried on the wind. Lyra didn't respond immediately, her gaze fixed on the distant stars. She felt something stirring within her, something unfamiliar but undeniable. She had been suppressing it, afraid to give it a name. But now, with Jackson's steady presence beside her, she could no longer ignore it. "I've been thinking," she began slowly, her voice almost trembling with the weight of her words, "about everything I've learned, about you, about what you've shown me." Jackson didn't interrupt, merely watching her, his expression attentive but patient. "I don't know how to explain it," she continued, her voice growing softer. "I've spent my life hiding behind walls, behind what my people told me was the only way to be. But when I'm with you, I feel like I'm seeing everything for the first time. Like the world isn't just something to conquer, something to control. It's something to experience, something to live." Jackson's heart gave a quiet lurch as he listened to her words. She was opening up to him in a way he had never expected. The strength she had shown throughout her life, the fierce independence that had made her who she was now giving way to something more fragile, more human. And it made her even more beautiful to him. He reached out, his hand finding hers once more, the simple touch a reminder of the journey they had taken together, how far they had both come. "I never thought I'd be the one to make a difference," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I was too far gone, too far removed from anything real. But with you, Jackson, I feel like I can breathe again. I feel like I can finally be free." Jackson's heart swelled, and without thinking, he pulled her closer, wrapping his arms around her. It wasn't a passionate embrace. It was something more intimate, more genuine. He held her as if she was something fragile, something he had to protect. Not because she was weak, but because she was worth protecting. "You are free, Lyra," he murmured, his voice full of conviction. "You've always been free. You just didn't know it until now." Lyra closed her eyes, leaning into his chest. She had never known this kind of comfort, the kind that wasn't tied to power or control, the kind that was soft and unconditional. For the first time in her life, she felt safe. And for the first time, she realized that she didn't need to be in control all the time. She didn't have to be the perfect soldier, the perfect representative of her people. She could just be her. A silence fell between them. But it wasn't uncomfortable. It was peaceful, filled with a quiet understanding that something had changed, something profound. "I think I'm ready to learn more," she said after a long pause, her voice steady but full of something new, ready to let go of the past, to learn how to be more than what I was trained to be. Jackson smiled, a warmth in his eyes. "And I'll be right here, Lyra, every step of the way." And as the stars glittered above them, Lyra knew that, for the first time in her life, she was not alone. She was no longer bound by her past or her people's expectations. She had a future, one she was ready to face, with Jackson by her side. The next morning, the sun rose over the alien landscape, casting a soft golden glow over the world they had come to know. The silence was different now, warmer, somehow filled with possibility instead of the dread of what might come next. Jackson and Lyra sat together at the table in their small quarters, a peaceful quiet between them. There was no urgency, no pressing mission looming over their heads. For once, there was nothing but time. Lyra stared out the small window, watching the morning light shimmer over the vast desert expanse below. She had always seen the universe as a cold, unforgiving place, a place of survival, where every interaction, every relationship was a calculation, a transaction, a way to gain the upper hand. She had never known what it was like to simply exist, to live, without constantly analyzing the risks and rewards. But now, with Jackson by her side, she was beginning to see that there could be something more. "You're quiet," Jackson said, his voice soft, breaking the stillness. Lyra blinked, shaking herself from her thoughts. "I'm just thinking," she said, her voice quieter than usual. "About everything, really. About how much has changed." Jackson smiled, his eyes warm with understanding. He reached across the table, his fingers grazing hers. It was a simple gesture, but it meant everything. They hadn't spoken much about what they had shared, not in so many words. But there was an unspoken understanding between them now, a connection that went beyond the words they could say. "Change isn't always easy," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "But sometimes it's the only way forward." Lyra's gaze softened and she turned to face him, a trace of vulnerability in her eyes. "I didn't know what I was missing until I met you, Jackson. I didn't know that I could feel like this, like I'm more than just a soldier, more than just a weapon. I never thought I could have this." Jackson reached out, cupping her hand in his thumb tracing gentle circles over her skin. "You are more than that, Lyra. You're more than anything they ever taught you. And I know it's scary, but you're not alone in this anymore. Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." For the first time in her life, Lyra felt the weight of those words sink into her chest, not as a fleeting hope, but as a truth she was finally ready to accept. She had spent so long thinking that she had to face everything alone, that her worth came from her ability to fight and survive. But now, with Jackson, she saw something different. She didn't have to fight alone. She didn't have to carry the world on her shoulders by herself. As they sat there, the quiet stretching between them, Lyra felt something stirring within her, a sense of resolve. She wasn't sure where the path ahead would lead, but for the first time in years, she was ready to walk it, not as a warrior, not as a soldier of her people, but as herself, as Lyra. There was a knock at the door, breaking the moment, and they both looked up. Lyra hesitated, then stood, crossing the room to answer it. When she opened the door, it wasn't just any officer or soldier who stood on the other side. It was one of the leaders of the Tarvan people, Shalak, a high-ranking general and one of the few who had survived the previous conflicts. His presence was commanding, his eyes sharp with authority. But as he stepped into the room, his gaze immediately locked onto Lyra, and for a brief moment, something in his expression shifted. Recognition, expectation. "Lyra," Shalak said, his voice low but thick with authority, "I've come to speak with you. It's time to decide what's next for your people." Lyra's stomach tightened. She hadn't expected him to arrive so soon. In truth, she had hoped for more time to process everything that had happened between her and Jackson, to figure out who she was becoming before confronting the harsh realities of her past. But it seemed the time had come. Jackson stood slowly, his eyes flickering between Lyra and the general. He sensed the tension immediately, the weight of the situation pressing down on them. He had no idea what had transpired between Lyra and Shalak, but he knew it wasn't good. He knew the politics of her people, and he understood the way power played a role in everything they did. "I'm not going back, Shalak," Lyra said before he could speak further. Her voice was steady, but there was a firmness in it that even she hadn't expected. "I've made my choice. I'm not going to follow the same path that led to the destruction of my people." Shalak's eyes narrowed, but there was something in his gaze, something darker. "You will follow the path laid out for you. Lyra, you were chosen to lead. You can't just abandon your people. Not now, not when they need you most." Lyra's heart raced as she faced the familiar pressure. The weight of her people's expectations bore down on her, just as it always had. But now it felt different. She no longer felt as if she was trapped in a cage, forced to live up to a destiny that wasn't her own. "I'm not abandoning anyone," she replied, her voice unwavering. "I'm choosing a different path, one where my people can have a future, not just a war. I won't be a weapon for anyone anymore, not even for you." Shalak's jaw clenched, and for a moment, Lyra could see the fury building in his eyes. But then, something changed. His expression hardened into something colder, more calculating. "You'll regret this, Lyra," he warned. "The path you're choosing will lead to nothing but destruction. You think you can change everything with a few words, but you're wrong. Your people will never accept this." Lyra met his gaze, unflinching. "I'm not doing this for them. I'm doing this for me. And for what's left of us. We can still change, Shalak. We can still have a future. But it starts with breaking free from the past." There was a long silence, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Finally, Shalak turned, his expression unreadable. "We'll see how long that resolve lasts," he muttered under his breath, before striding out of the room without another word. As the door closed behind him, Lyra stood there, her heart racing. She had made her choice, But the price of that choice was becoming clearer by the moment. Her people would not give up their power easily. They would not accept her defection without a fight. But she wasn't afraid anymore. Jackson stepped up beside her, his hand finding hers once more. "Whatever comes next, we'll face it together," he said softly, his voice full of reassurance. Lyra turned to him, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. Yes, together. And for the first time in her life, she truly believed it. The days that followed Shalek's visit were tense, thick with uncertainty. Lyra had never expected to face such a fierce resistance from her people. For years, she had been one of their strongest leaders, a symbol of power and unyielding determination. And now, she had chosen a different path, a path that was at odds with everything she'd been taught to believe. Jackson stayed close by her side, offering her support in ways that she had never known she needed. There were moments when Lyra felt the weight of her decision pressing down on her, moments when the old fear crept back in, fear of failure, fear of losing everything she had once believed in. But every time doubt threatened to take hold, Jackson was there, a steady presence, reminding her that she wasn't alone. It was late one evening, as they sat in their small quarters, that Lyra's thoughts turned to the future. The sun had long since set, and the stars above them twinkled in the sky like a million tiny eyes watching from afar. The light from the small lamp beside them cast soft shadows on the walls, and for the first time in days, the quiet felt peaceful rather than oppressive. "Do you ever think about what happens after all this?" Lyra asked, her voice breaking the silence. She wasn't sure what she expected him to say, but the question had been lingering in her mind for days. Jackson leaned back in his chair, his eyes focused on her, his expression thoughtful. "All the time," he said softly. "I think about the future every day, about what happens after the war, after the fighting stops. But sometimes you can't focus too much on the end game. Sometimes it's about making sure you do what's right in the moment, no matter how difficult it seems." Lyra nodded, the weight of his words sinking in. She had spent her entire life focusing on the next battle, the next strategic move, the next fight for survival. She had never really stopped to consider what came after. What came when the war was over, when there were no more enemies to fight? What would become of her people then? What would become of her? "I don't know what will happen," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I know I can't keep living the way I've lived. I've been so focused on fighting, on surviving, that I forgot what it meant to truly live." Jackson's eyes softened, and he stood, crossing the room to her. He sat beside her, his presence comforting in the stillness. "You don't have to know everything right now, Lyra. You just have to take it one step at a time. The rest will fall into place." She leaned into him, the warmth of his body a stark contrast to the cold, unforgiving world outside. For a moment, she allowed herself to close her eyes and simply breathe. She had spent so many years running, fighting, never allowing herself to truly rest. But now, with Jackson, she could feel the possibility of something else, something more than just survival. "I'm scared," she whispered, her voice trembling with the admission. "I'm scared of what's coming. Scared that I'm making a mistake. Scared that I'll lose everything I've ever known." Jackson's arm wrapped around her, pulling her close, and for a moment, Lyra allowed herself to feel the full weight of her fears. But she didn't feel alone in them. She felt safe. Safe with him. Safe in this small, quiet moment where nothing seemed impossible. "You're not alone," he said quietly, his voice firm but gentle. "We'll face it all together, no matter what happens." Lyra looked up at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. It was a look that said more than words ever could. In that moment, she knew that no matter what came next, no matter the obstacles they would face, no matter the battles that still loomed ahead, she had found something worth fighting for, something worth living for. As the days turned into weeks, Lyra found herself beginning to take the steps necessary to carve out the future she wanted. She met with the remaining leaders of her people, those who still held power, and she began to lay the groundwork for a new way forward. It wasn't easy. There were arguments, protests, and heated debates. But Lyra stood her ground. She had come to realize that change wasn't just about winning battles. It was about shifting the course of a people's future. It was about breaking free from the cycles of violence and war that had defined them for centuries. She still had much to learn, and there were days when the weight of her responsibility threatened to overwhelm her. But Jackson was always there, a constant source of strength and reassurance. He never once faltered in his belief in her, never once made her feel like she was making a mistake. And gradually, Lyra began to feel something new within herself. Hope. Hope for a future where her people could be more than just conquerors. Hope for a future where love and connection were not weaknesses, but strengths. A future where she could be more than just a weapon. One evening, as they sat together in the quiet of their quarters, Lyra looked at Jackson, her heart full of emotion. "I never thought I'd find this," she said softly, her voice filled with wonder. "I never thought I could feel this, alive." Jackson smiled, his eyes filled with affection. "I'm glad you're feeling that way, Lyra. You deserve to. You fought so long, but now it's time for something different, something better." Lyra leaned forward, her hand reaching for his. Their fingers intertwined, a simple gesture, but one that meant everything. They had come so far together, and they both knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but they also knew that they didn't have to face it alone. They had each other, and that was enough. As they sat there, hand in hand, the stars outside seemed to shine a little brighter, as if the universe itself was offering them a promise that no matter what the future held, they would face it together, and that, for the first time in her life, was enough for Lyra. She had found her place in this vast, uncertain universe, and it was with him. As the weeks passed, the world around Lyra began to change. The Tarvan people, though reluctant at first, slowly started to listen. Some resisted, clinging to old ways, but many others were drawn to Lyra's vision of a future not dominated by war, but built on peace, unity, and cooperation. It was an uphill battle, but it was one that Lyra was ready for, and Jackson was there by her side every step of the way. The weight of her new role as a leader felt different now. It wasn't the burden of an oppressive destiny, but the responsibility of someone who had chosen to stand up for what was right. She still carried the echoes of her past with her, the years of war, the training that had molded her into a weapon, but those memories no longer defined her. She had a new purpose now, one that was rooted in love and connection. One evening, as Lyra sat at the table, reviewing diplomatic messages from various factions, Jackson entered the room. His face, though tired from their long journey, was filled with warmth and something else, pride. "I think we've made a breakthrough," he said, his voice steady but filled with excitement. "The Council has agreed to start working on the peace talks. It's a huge step forward." Lyra looked up, her eyes bright with a mixture of relief and disbelief. "Really? They're finally listening." "They are," Jackson replied, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "You've shown them that there's more to life than just survival. You've made them believe in something better. You've made me believe in something better." Her heart swelled at his words, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to feel hope, true hope, hope for a future she had never imagined possible. She stood, crossing the room to him. Without thinking, she wrapped her arms around him in a quiet, intimate embrace. The feeling of his warmth, the strength of his arms around her, reminded her of everything she had fought for, not just the survival of her people, but the chance for something greater. "I never thought I'd get here," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I never thought I could change. I didn't think I could ever find something this real." Jackson pulled back slightly to look into her eyes, his gaze tender. "You've always had it in you, Lyra. All you needed was the right reason to believe in yourself." Her lips curved into a soft smile, and in that moment she knew he was right. The battle she had fought wasn't just for her people. It had been for herself, too. She had spent so long being someone she wasn't, someone others had expected her to be. But now, she had the chance to be someone new, someone whole, and she wasn't doing it alone. "I'm ready for whatever comes next," she said, her voice steady and resolute. "But I know I can face it now, with you by my side." Jackson nodded, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "And I'll always be here, Lyra, every step of the way. Together, They stood at the threshold of a new future, one full of uncertainty but also full of hope. The road ahead would not be easy. There would be more challenges, more obstacles to overcome. But for the first time in her life, Lyra was no longer afraid of the unknown. She had found something worth fighting for, something that went beyond the violence of her past. It was a possibility of love, of peace, of a future not defined by conquest but by choice. As they stood there, hand in hand, the stars outside twinkled brightly, as if to remind them that the universe was vast, and their journey was just beginning. And in that vastness, Lyra had found her place. With him,